quiet corner of the state of New York, not far from the mighty Hudson River, there lies a small valley known to all as Sleepy Hollow. It is a place so drowsy, so steeped in a strange, enchanted calm, that time itself seems reluctant to stir within its bounds. The air there hangs heavy with mist and memory. The rustling of leaves and the murmur of brooks carry an otherworldly hush, as if the valley were perpetually caught between waking and dream. Long ago, the people of the region began to whisper that Sleepy Hollow was bewitched. Some said that a peculiar atmosphere had settled over the valley during the earliest days of the Dutch settlement, a spell left behind by some old German doctor or a native spirit of the woods. Others claimed the place had been touched by the supernatural, as though the veil between worlds were thin there. Whatever the cause, those who lived within its borders found themselves subject to visions, strange fancies, and deep, trance-like reveries. It was a place where the very air seemed charged with enchantment. Men and women walking its shaded paths might drift into a dream without knowing it. The church bell tolled softly over the meadows, its echo floating lazily through the trees. The brook, gliding beneath willows and over mossy stones, seemed to hum an ancient lullaby. Every sound was softened, every color dimmed, every hour stretched into eternity. Yet Sleepy Hollow was not merely a land of quiet beauty, it was also a land of ghosts. Its inhabitants, being of Dutch descent and rich in superstition, loved nothing more than to tell tales by the fireside. They spoke of phantom horsemen galloping through the night, of spectral soldiers, and of mysterious lights flitting among the graves. And of all these legends, none was more feared or more often told than that of the headless horseman. This ghost, so the story went, was the spirit of a Hessian trooper who had lost his head to a cannonball during the Revolutionary War. His body had been buried in the churchyard of Sleepy Hollow, but his ghost could not rest. Each night he rode forth from his grave, mounted on a great black steed, seeking his lost head. The sound of his horse's hooves echoed like thunder through the valley, and any traveler unlucky enough to meet him rarely escaped without terror, or worse. Such was the atmosphere of Sleepy Hollow, half paradise, half phantasm, when one autumn day there arrived a new schoolmaster, a lanky fellow named Ichabod Crane. Ichabod was a native of Connecticut, a man of learning, and a figure so odd that he seemed almost a part of the valley's enchantment. He was tall and exceedingly thin, with narrow shoulders and long arms that dangled like willow branches. His head was small and flat at the top, with enormous ears and a long, beak-like nose that made him resemble a scarecrow come to life. His great green eyes were bright and eager, and his mouth, though wide, was perpetually stretched into a smile, half from good humor, half from self-satisfaction. Though awkward in appearance, Ichabod was a man of some talent. He had studied a bit of Latin, read a few thick volumes of history, and prided himself on his knowledge of psalmody, the art of singing hymns. In fact, besides teaching the village children their letters and sums, he served as the choir master at the little Dutch church that stood near the river. He boarded with the farmers whose children he taught, moving from house to house like a traveling scholar. Wherever he stayed, Ichabod made himself as agreeable as possible, for he was not one to refuse a good meal or a soft bed. His appetite was legendary, a fact that might have been amusing were it not for the modest incomes of his hosts. Still, his manners were polite, his speech full of charm, and he had a knack for flattering the Dutch wives, who found his learned airs irresistible. To the children, Ichabod was both master and tyrant. His long, flexible birch rod was as much a symbol of his rule as his voice was of his vanity. Yet he was not cruel, only strict, believing that order was the foundation of learning. After school hours, however, his demeanor softened. He would sit with the smaller ones, telling them ghost stories until their eyes grew wide with wonder. And when he walked home through the twilight woods, even Ichabod's own imagination began to play tricks on him. Every rustle of leaves became a whisper, every shadow a lurking spirit. But Ichabod had one passion stronger than superstition, and that was ambition. It was not long before he cast his eye upon the richest prize in the neighborhood, Katrina Van Tassel, the only daughter of the wealthy farmer Baltus Van Tassel. Katrina was a blooming lass of 18, plump as a partridge, rosy-cheeked, and full of mischief. She was known for her coquettish smile and for the graceful way she wore her short, blue petticoat and red stockings, a vision that set many a young man's heart aflame. Ichabod, ever practical, saw in Katrina not only beauty but a future of comfort and plenty. The Van Tassel farm was vast and fertile, its barns overflowing with wheat, its meadows rich with cattle, and its orchards heavy with fruit. To Ichabod's mind, the prospect of marrying Katrina was as delightful as any fairy tale, and he was soon as devoted to the pursuit of her favor as he was to his studies. Yet Ichabod was not the only admirer of Katrina. Among his rivals stood one whose presence would soon turn the quiet valley into a stage of rivalry and fear, Abraham Van Brunt, better known as Brom Bones. Brom was the very opposite of Ichabod, broad-shouldered, powerful, and daring, with a hearty laugh and a taste for mischief. He was the hero of every rustic frolic, the leader in races, wrestling matches, and all feats of strength. His horse, Daredevil, was as wild and fearless as himself. Though many young men respected him, and many feared him, even Brom had one weakness, his infatuation with Katrina Van Tassel. Thus the stage was set, the dreamlike valley, the timid scholar, the fiery rival, and the fair lady whose favor might turn either man's fortune. As autumn deepened, the air of Sleepy Hollow grew chill and golden. The leaves turned to fire, the evenings grew longer, and talk of ghosts once more filled the taverns and hearthsides. It was during this season of shadow and harvest that Ichabod Crane, drawn by love and by superstition alike, found himself stepping ever deeper into the strange legend of the Hollow, a legend that would soon claim him as its most famous victim. For in Sleepy Hollow, where dreams and phantoms are one and the same, the line between the living and the dead is easily crossed, and once crossed, never forgotten. In the weeks that followed his arrival at Sleepy Hollow, Ichabod Crane settled comfortably into the rhythm of rural life. His tall, awkward figure became a familiar sight along the winding lanes, his lank limbs striding briskly as he made his way to and from the little schoolhouse. The villagers, though they laughed quietly at his peculiar manners, grew fond of him, for he was a man of easy temper, polite speech, and endless curiosity. Yet it was his pursuit of Katrina Van Tassel that soon became the favorite subject of gossip throughout the valley. Ichabod had first seen Katrina on a bright afternoon when he was invited to teach psalmody at the Dutch church near the Van Tassel farm. She had arrived on horseback, her cheeks glowing from the autumn air, her ribbons fluttering like playful spirits in the wind. Ichabod, who fancied himself something of a ladies' man despite his ungainly form, was instantly bewitched. He watched her from afar with the air of a scholar studying a new and fascinating subject, and before the service ended, his heart and his imagination were hopelessly entangled. To him, Katrina was not merely a beautiful girl. She was a vision of comfort and abundance. As Ichabod walked home that evening through the dusky woods, his mind wandered through glorious daydreams. He pictured himself seated at the head of the Van Tassel table, surrounded by pies and roasted fowl, with fat turkeys gobbling in the yard and apple orchards stretching into the distance. In his fancy, he saw the farm's golden wheat bending under the breeze, the barns full of sweet-smelling hay, and himself, Ichabod Crane, master of all. Such dreams, though laughable to others, were deadly serious to Ichabod, for he was a man whose imagination could turn shadows into spirits and desires into destiny. And so he began his campaign to win Katrina's favor. He approached the task with the same diligence he gave to his teaching. Whenever his pupils were Van Tassel cousins or neighbors, he made sure their lessons were extra long and their praise extra loud, so that word of his virtue might reach Katrina's ears. On Sundays, he sang the loudest in church, his nasal voice rising above the congregation in what he believed to be melodious triumph. When he passed Katrina in the lanes, he bowed with exaggerated grace, sweeping his long arms as though conducting an orchestra of invisible admirers. Katrina, for her part, was not unaware of the attention. She was a coquette of rare skill, a young woman who knew how to play the delicate game of admiration and retreat. She smiled upon Ichabod just enough to encourage his hopes, while never dismissing the attentions of other suitors. And of all those rivals, none watched Ichabod more closely than Brom Bones. Brom Van Brunt was the hero of every country frolic within 10 miles. His feats of strength were spoken of with admiration, and his pranks with dread. He was known to race his horse through the narrowest lanes, to leap fences with reckless glee, and to laugh at danger as if it were an old friend. His gang of rough riders, called the Brom Bones Boys, followed him everywhere, causing mischief and merry uproar wherever they went. Brom's love for Katrina was the one matter in which he was truly serious. He had courted her openly for months before Ichabod's arrival, and he had little patience for competition. Yet he had enough pride to avoid open quarrel. Instead, he turned to his favorite weapon, humor. At first, Brom laughed off the schoolmaster's pretensions. "That bag of bones?" he'd say to his friends. He'd snap in half if the wind blew too hard. But when he saw Katrina smile at Ichabod's compliments, Brom's laughter grew sharp. He began to play tricks designed to torment the poor pedagogue. One night, Ichabod found his schoolhouse mysteriously locked, though he had the only key. Another morning, he discovered his classroom in chaos, benches overturned, slates broken, and a chalk drawing of a long-necked scarecrow labeled Ichabod Crane, Knight of Sleepy Hollow. Once, when Ichabod led a group of children in hymn practice, Brom's friends hid behind the churchyard fence and mimicked his high, squeaking voice until the pupils burst into laughter. Ichabod endured these pranks with a mixture of dignity and secret dread. He knew Brom was behind them, but he dared not confront the man. Instead, he sought comfort in the company of the Van Tassels, where his imagination could feast upon their hospitality. Baltus Van Tassel, Katrina's father, was a hearty, contented farmer, round of face, soft of heart, and fond of good company. His house, nestled among orchards and fields, was the picture of Dutch prosperity. Its kitchen was the very temple of abundance. Strings of onions and peppers hung from the ceiling, shelves groaned under pies and preserves, and the smell of roasted meats filled the air. To Ichabod, every visit to the Van Tassel farm was a foretaste of paradise. He would sit by the hearth after supper, his long legs awkwardly folded, listening to Baltus tell stories of the old days of Indian wars, of the early Dutch settlers, and of the mysterious apparitions that haunted the hollow. The farmer's wife would nod solemnly as she stirred the coals, and Ichabod, though pretending courage, would draw his chair closer to the light. For Sleepy Hollow, as autumn deepened, became a world of shadows and tales. The evenings grew cool and misty. The moon rose over the meadows like a pale, enchanted coin. It was at such hours that the villagers gathered to speak of ghosts, the woman in white who haunted Raven Rock, the phantom soldier who stood guard near the churchyard, and most of all, the dreadful headless horseman. Ichabod, who loved nothing more than a good story, was both terrified and fascinated. His mind, rich with superstition, absorbed every detail. The old women told him that the horseman's galloping was often heard near the church bridge at midnight, and that he was said to vanish in a flash of fire when he reached the graveyard gate. The schoolmaster listened with wide eyes and trembling lips, promising himself he would never travel that road alone, though he knew, deep down, that one day he must. As the harvest season approached, excitement spread through the valley. The Van Tassels announced their autumn feast, a grand gathering of neighbors and friends to celebrate the year's bounty. There would be music, dancing, and tables laden with delicacies, and, most important of all, Katrina Van Tassel would be the star of the evening. Ichabod saw in this feast his great opportunity. He resolved to make his suit to Katrina that very night, to win her heart and perhaps even secure her promise of marriage. He polished his best black coat, brushed the dust from his only pair of shoes, and borrowed a horse from the farmer with whom he boarded a broken-down plough nag named Gunpowder, whose temper was as uncertain as his gait. As Ichabod prepared for the feast, his imagination ran riot. He pictured himself riding triumphantly beside Katrina, admired by all, while Brom Bones glowered in defeat. He rehearsed clever speeches and romantic compliments, though they sounded far less graceful aloud than in his thoughts. Still, his confidence was high for Ichabod Crane. Despite his fears of ghosts, feared no rival when his ambition was at stake. And so, on the evening of the great gathering, the lanky schoolmaster mounted Gunpowder and set forth down the road to the Van Tassel farm. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a sky streaked with crimson and gold. The air was cool and fragrant with the scent of harvested corn. The leaves rustled overhead, whispering secrets of the coming night. Ichabod rode slowly, humming a psalm to steady his nerves. As he passed through the woods, he fancied he saw shapes moving among the trees, but when he looked again, there was nothing but the fading light. The brook gurgled beside him, its voice soft and low like laughter. When at last the farmstead lights came into view, shining warmly through the dusk, Ichabod's spirits rose. He urged Gunpowder forward, eager to join the revelry that might change his fate forever. At the Van Tassel home, the scene was one of joyous festivity. Lanterns hung from the porch and barn doors, casting golden pools of light upon the guests. Fiddles sang lively tunes, and the floorboards trembled beneath the stamping feet of dancers. The smell of roasted meats and cider filled the air, mingling with laughter and song. Katrina, radiant in a gown of white muslin with ribbons of sky blue, moved gracefully among the crowd. Her eyes sparkled, her laughter chimed like silver bells, and Ichabod, upon seeing her, felt his knees weaken, yet his determination only grew stronger. He greeted the company with elaborate courtesy, bowing low and shaking hands with every farmer and dame. The younger girls giggled behind their fans at his awkward gallantry, while the older matrons smiled approvingly. Even Baltus Van Tassel clapped him on the shoulder, declaring that no man could sing a psalm like Master Crane. But among the guests was Brom Bones, broad, confident, and grinning. He leaned against the fireplace, arms folded, watching Ichabod with a look that was half amusement, half warning. When Ichabod approached, Brom merely nodded and said, "Evening, Crane. I hope Gunpowder brought you here safe. He's not much for company after dark." Ichabod forced a laugh, though his voice trembled. "A fine horse, sir, spirited and strong." "Spirited, aye," said Brom with a wink. "Strong in the legs, but weak in the head, rather like his rider, some might say." The company roared with laughter, but Ichabod only smiled, determined not to be rattled. The night was still young, and his chance with Katrina still awaited. As the music struck up and the dancers formed their lines, Ichabod offered his hand to the fair Katrina. She accepted with a playful smile, and together they joined the lively whirl of motion. Ichabod's long limbs moved with surprising grace, his coat-tails flying as he capered across the floor. The crowd cheered, and even Brom's grin faded for a moment as he watched them. So the evening went on, music, laughter, and endless plates of food. And when at last the dancing ceased, the guests gathered in small circles to tell stories of ghosts and omens. It was then, under the dim light of the hearth, that the talk turned once more to the Headless Horseman. The great autumn feast at the Van Tassel farm was at its height. The last of the fiddle tunes faded into laughter, and the scent of cider and roasted meats hung heavy in the warm night air. Farmers leaned back in their chairs with satisfied sighs. The younger folk lingered by the windows or strolled through the moonlit orchards, whispering and laughing softly. The great barn, where the dancing had taken place, glowed with lantern light, its doors wide open to the cool night beyond. Ichabod Crane, flushed from dancing and giddy from success, felt as though the world had never been so kind. He had danced with Katrina more than once, and she had smiled upon him with that teasing sweetness that set his heart aflame. In his imagination, he already saw himself the master of the Van Tassel estate, the envy of every man in the hollow. He was so full of hope that even Brom Bones' dark glances no longer troubled him. Brom had danced too, but his mood had soured as the evening wore on. His loud laughter had grown strained, and he had taken to boasting of his horse daredevil speed and courage, perhaps as a way to reassert his power before the crowd. Yet even Brom seemed subdued when old Baltus called for the company to gather near the hearth, for it was time for the storytelling to begin. The fire crackled and cast flickering shadows on the beams as the guests settled in. Some sat on benches, others stood in clusters, and a few leaned against the walls, sipping cider. The air outside had turned crisp, and the wind whispered faintly through the trees beyond the windows. It was the perfect hour for tales of the supernatural, and in Sleepy Hollow there was no shortage of them. One of the farmers began with a tale of a ghostly woman who wandered the old bridge at Raven Rock, her cries heard on stormy nights. Another spoke of a phantom light seen near Wiley's swamp, said to lure travelers into the mire. Each story brought gasps and nervous laughter, and Ichabod, though pretending composure, edged closer to the fire. Then Brom Bones, his eyes glinting mischievously, took his turn. "Well," he said, "all these ghosts are well and good, but none can match the Headless Horseman of our hollow." A hush fell over the room. Even Baltus Van Tassel crossed himself and murmured, "Aye, the trooper. He rides again." Brom continued, his voice low and dramatic. "You all know the tale, the Hessian soldier who lost his head by a cannonball during the war. He's been seen many times near the old church. I met him once myself." All eyes turned to Brom. Even Katrina looked at him with wide-eyed curiosity. Ichabod swallowed hard, his heart thudding. "It was a few years back," Brom said, leaning forward. "One dark night after a merry frolic over at the Hollow. I was riding home on Daredevil when I heard a sound behind me, the pounding of hooves. I turned, and there he was, a great rider dressed all in black, with no head upon his shoulders. He rode a mighty black steed, fast as wind, and carried his head before him, resting it on the saddle pommel." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Ichabod's mouth went dry. "I gave him no chance to come closer," Brom continued with a grin. "I clapped spurs to Daredevil and raced for the church bridge. He followed close behind, so close I could feel the heat of his horse's breath. But as I crossed the bridge, he vanished in a flash of fire, just as the old stories say." "I swear it on my own life." The company broke into murmurs. Some doubted, others nodded gravely. Brom leaned back, pleased with the effect of his tale. "So, Take care, friends, he added with a laugh, for the horseman rides again when the moon is high, and he likes the company of travelers who've stayed out too late. Laughter followed, but it was uneasy. The fire sputtered, and a gust of wind sent the shadows dancing. Ichabod forced a nervous smile, but inside, his imagination was already racing. Every word of Brom's story took root in his fertile mind. He could almost see the dreadful figure riding through the mist, the headless form, the gleaming saddle, the thunder of hooves. The evening drew to a close. One by one, the guests rose, wrapped their cloaks, and took their leave. The music was gone, the lanterns dimmed, and only the faint laughter of the last revelers echoed through the orchards. Ichabod lingered, hoping for a few private words with Katrina. He found her in a quiet corner of the parlor, her face half hidden by candlelight. What passed between them was never fully known, but when Ichabod emerged a few minutes later, his expression was grave. The hopeful glow that had filled him all evening was gone, replaced by something like despair. Whether Katrina had rejected his advances outright or simply teased him with cold indifference, no one could say, but the schoolmaster's dream of wealth and romance had been dashed. He mounted his weary horse Gunpowder and turned down the road toward Sleepy Hollow. The night was deep and silent now. The moon had disappeared behind thick clouds, and the stars shone faintly through the mist. The air was cool, the woods dark. Even Gunpowder seemed uneasy, his ears twitching at every sound. Ichabod rode slowly, his thoughts heavy. The night pressed close around him, filled with strange rustlings and sighs. The croak of a frog in the marsh sounded like a distant voice. The chirp of a night bird became a ghostly whistle. As he passed beneath great oaks, the branches swayed and creaked like the limbs of giants. He tried to cheer himself by humming a hymn, but his voice quavered. "Why should I fear?" he muttered. "There are no ghosts, only tales and shadows." Yet his imagination betrayed him at every turn. He remembered Brom's story, the glowing eyes of the phantom steed, the vanishing at the bridge. The road grew narrower, winding through dense woods. On one side lay a deep hollow where the brook gurgled unseen. On the other, a high, grassy knoll where fireflies flickered faintly. Every shape seemed alive, every sound a whisper of pursuit. At last he reached a small glen known as Wiley's Swamp, one of the most haunted places in the hollow. Great oaks stood here like sentinels, their gnarled roots rising from the dark water. The air was thick with fog, and the moon broke through the clouds, only to vanish again. Gunpowder halted suddenly, snorting. Ichabod peered ahead. Was that a white object by the brook? No, only a weathered stump. He laughed nervously, urging the horse on. But then another sound. A distinct rustling among the bushes. He turned in the saddle, heart pounding. "Who's there?" he called. No answer, only silence. Then, faintly, the sound came again, the creak of a branch, the clatter of a hoof. Ichabod's blood ran cold. He urged Gunpowder forward, but the old horse moved reluctantly, his gait uneven. The rustling grew louder, and then, out of the shadows of the trees, there appeared a great black horse, and upon it, a rider. The figure was cloaked in darkness. He rode silently, his horse's hooves making scarcely a sound. Ichabod's trembling hand gripped the reins. "Good evening, friend," he stammered, trying to sound brave. The stranger made no reply. They rode on together, side by side, through the gloom. Ichabod quickened his pace. The rider matched it. He slowed. The rider slowed too. A cold sweat broke across his brow. At last, in a burst of courage, he turned his head and saw, to his horror, that the rider's head was not upon his shoulders, but carried before him, resting upon the saddle pommel. A cry escaped Ichabod's lips. He lashed Gunpowder with the whip, and the startled beast sprang forward, galloping madly down the road. The headless horseman followed close behind. The forest echoed with the pounding of hooves, the crash of branches, the wild cries of the desperate schoolmaster. Over hill and hollow they raced, the ghost always at Ichabod's heels. The wind tore at his coat, the saddle creaked, and Gunpowder snorted and stumbled, nearly throwing him. Through the trees ahead, he saw the faint gleam of the bridge by the church where Brom's tale had ended. If he could only reach it. "On, Gunpowder, on!" he shouted. The old horse, driven by terror, plunged forward. The bridge loomed nearer, the ghost steed thundering just behind. Ichabod dared a glance over his shoulder. The horseman was raising his arm, holding the dreadful head high. They reached the bridge. Ichabod dashed across, heart leaping with hope. He turned once more, expecting to see his pursuer vanish in fire as Brom's story promised. But instead, the phantom rose in his stirrups and hurled the head straight at Ichabod. There was a crash, a cry, and then darkness. The next morning, Gunpowder was found grazing in a pasture, without saddle or bridle. Near the bridge lay Ichabod's hat, and close beside it, a shattered pumpkin. Ichabod Crane was never seen in Sleepy Hollow again. The evening of the grand party at the Van Tassel farmhouse arrived, glowing with golden light from the setting sun that spilled across the Hudson River. The air was thick with the scents of autumn-ripe apples, hay, and roasted corn drifting from the barns. The entire countryside seemed to move toward the mansion that night. Young men in their Sunday best, girls with ribbons fluttering from their bonnets, farmers wearing polished boots and freshly brushed coats. Laughter and the clattering of horse hooves filled the dusty lanes as everyone made their way to the harvest celebration. Ichabod Crane, dressed in his best, an old black coat with brass buttons and a stiffly pressed collar that scratched his neck, rode solemnly on the borrowed plow horse named Gunpowder. The animal was gaunt, one-eyed, and nervous, but Ichabod held the reins with pride, imagining himself a gallant knight approaching the castle of his lady. The image delighted him. He fancied that he cut quite a figure as he trotted up the path, his lanky form swaying comically with every step of the tired horse. When he reached the Van Tassel homestead, the sight before him was splendid indeed. The farmhouse, large and cheerful, glowed with lamplight that spilled through every window. The porch was lined with carved pumpkins and bunches of corn. Music already floated through the air. Inside, the tables groaned under the weight of pies, donuts, roasted meats, and apple cider. Ichabod's eyes gleamed as he beheld the feast, for no man in Sleepy Hollow loved food more than he. He inhaled deeply, the smell of roast goose filling him with near religious delight. Katrina Van Tassel was the heart of the celebration. She moved gracefully through the crowd, her laughter light and teasing. Her cheeks were flushed with the warmth of the evening, and her eyes shone like stars. Ichabod could not take his gaze off her. He bowed awkwardly when she approached, stammering a greeting, while Brom Bones, broad-shouldered, confident, watched from across the room, a faint grin curling at the corner of his mouth. The dance began soon after. Ichabod, surprisingly light on his feet, led Katrina through the figures with exaggerated grace. His long arms waved like windmill blades, his coat-tails flew behind him as he pranced and spun, utterly lost in his own joy. The fiddler played faster, stomping his foot, and the floorboards shook under the rhythm of boots. Around them, laughter and clapping filled the hall. To Ichabod, it was paradise. He imagined himself, already, the master of this fine house, the owner of the lands stretching across the valley. He saw in his mind the barns full of grain, the herds of fat cattle, the shining silver on the dining table, all of it his, with Katrina by his side. Every glance she gave him, every smile, he took as proof that his dream was near fulfillment. When the dancing ended, the guests gathered in the parlor to tell stories. It was a custom in Sleepy Hollow that no evening ended without tales of ghosts and wonders. The older farmers leaned back in their chairs, puffing pipes, and spoke in slow, grave tones about the strange things seen in the valley, the lights moving in the woods, the voices that called from the swamp at night. The young ladies shivered and drew their shawls closer. Then the subject turned, as it always did, to the headless horseman. Old Brower swore he had once seen the horseman near the churchyard, galloping silently past him and vanishing in a flash of fire. Another man told of a dark night when the horseman had challenged him to a race, then turned suddenly into a skeleton at the bridge. Laughter and gasps filled the room. Brom Bones, not to be outdone, leaned forward with a grin. "I met him once myself," he said proudly, "coming home from old Swartwout's place. I offered him a race to the church bridge, and by thunder, I was ahead. But when I turned to look, poof, he vanished in smoke, like a cannon blast." The listeners burst into astonished laughter, though some looked uneasily toward the windows, where the wind moaned against the shutters. Ichabod, for his part, tried to appear amused, but his heart thudded in his chest. His imagination, already vivid, painted every story in frightening detail. He could almost see the horseman now, galloping through the mists, his sword gleaming, his head carried on the pommel of his saddle. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. When the last tale was told and the laughter died away, the guests began to depart. The moon was high, casting a pale silver glow over the fields. Ichabod lingered, hoping for a quiet word with Katrina before he left. He found her at the far end of the parlor, near the open window, where the cool night air drifted in. We do not know what words passed between them. Some said he proposed that night, others whispered that he pressed his hopes too eagerly. But when Ichabod emerged from the farmhouse a few minutes later, his face was pale and his expression dark. Whatever Katrina had said, it had struck him to the heart. The dream was shattered. The mansion, the lands, the wealth, all vanished like smoke. He walked silently to where Gunpowder waited, the night wind rustling through the trees. The sounds of music and laughter still floated from the house, mocking him. With a heavy heart, he mounted and turned down the path toward Sleepy Hollow. The road was long, winding through woods and meadows. The moon had slipped behind the clouds, leaving the land in dim shadow. Crickets chirped, and now and then the distant hoot of an owl echoed through the stillness. Ichabod tried to sing a psalm to keep up his courage, but his voice trembled. He passed the great tulip tree said to be haunted by Major Andre, the British spy. Its limbs twisted like skeletal arms, creaking in the wind. He urged Gunpowder forward, but the horse snorted and shied. Ichabod's imagination leapt to life again. He saw shapes in every bush, heard whispers in every rustle. As he reached the brook near Wiley's swamp, a sudden sound made his blood freeze. It was the faint clatter of hooves on the road behind him. He turned slowly. There, in the darkness, he saw a figure, a rider, large and silent, upon a black horse. The rider did not speak. He did not move, except to keep pace with Ichabod's trembling mount. The schoolmaster's voice caught in his throat. He tried to convince himself it was a traveler returning home from the party, but the longer he looked, the colder his blood ran. The figure's horse was enormous, its breath steaming like smoke. The rider sat erect, cloaked in shadow, and then Ichabod's heart stopped. The rider had no head. For a long moment, Ichabod Crane could not move. His breath came shallow and quick, his eyes fixed upon the dark shape that followed him through the misty night. The rider made no sound except the dull thud of hooves against the road. Gunpowder shifted uneasily beneath Ichabod, his ears flicking back, snorting with terror. The schoolmaster swallowed hard. "Who goes there?" he called, trying to sound brave, but his voice cracked, swallowed by the empty air. No answer came. The figure merely rode on, silent and steady, keeping a perfect distance behind. The road curved through the trees, where moonlight filtered weakly through the branches. Ichabod tried to hum a hymn, his voice trembling like a leaf in the wind, but the sound died in his throat. He quickened his pace. The rider matched him. He slowed. The rider slowed too. A cold sweat broke over Ichabod's forehead. He dared not look back again, but every nerve in his body screamed that something unnatural followed him. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. At last, summoning every ounce of courage he possessed, he turned once more, and what he saw made his heart turn to ice. The rider's horse drew closer, so close that Ichabod could see its glistening muscles and flaring nostrils. The rider's coat flapped open in the wind, revealing broad shoulders, a heavy belt, and most horrible of all, no head upon his shoulders. Instead, the head was carried before him, resting upon the pommel of the saddle, its face pale and ghastly in the moonlight. Its hollow eyes seemed to glare directly at Ichabod. Gunpowder gave a terrified neigh and bolted. Ichabod clung to the reins for dear life as they tore down the road, branches whipping his face, the wind howling in his ears. Behind him came the pounding of hooves, the headless horsemen in hot pursuit. "Run, Gunpowder! Run for your life!" Ichabod gasped, kicking the horse's sides. But Gunpowder, maddened by fear, veered from the path and plunged into the marshy fields. The tall reeds whipped around them as they splashed through a shallow stream. Mud clung to Ichabod's boots and coat. He looked back once. The horseman was still there, galloping easily, never losing ground. They burst out of the swamp and back onto the main road. The moon broke free of the clouds for a moment, lighting the landscape with a ghostly glow. Far ahead, Ichabod saw the outline of the old church bridge, the bridge that led to the churchyard where the horseman was said to vanish in a flash of fire. Salvation! If he could only reach it, he might be safe. He bent low over Gunpowder's neck, urging the exhausted beast onward. The horse's breath came in ragged bursts. Its hooves struck sparks from the stones. Behind them, the spectral rider loomed ever nearer. Ichabod could hear the snort of the great black steed, the creak of its saddle, the faint rattle of armor. The road wound through the trees, twisting like a serpent. The shadows seemed alive, stretching and flickering in the moonlight. At every turn, Ichabod's imagination conjured new horrors' faces in the leaves, hands reaching from the darkness. Yet always, behind them, the thunder of hooves. Suddenly, Gunpowder stumbled. Ichabod nearly flew from the saddle, clutching the mane in desperation. The horse recovered, but its gait was uneven now. Ichabod's heart pounded so loudly he could scarcely hear the night sounds. "Hold! Hold, boy! Hold! He cried, though his voice shook with terror. The horseman drew alongside for an instant so close that Ichabod could see the dull gleam of the sword hanging at the phantom's side. The head in his hand seemed to grin, its hollow sockets burning faintly like coals. Ichabod gave a strangled cry and lashed Gunpowder with the whip. The horse surged forward again, muscles straining. The church bell, faint but distinct, tolled midnight in the distance. At that sound, something in Ichabod's mind broke. He began to pray aloud, reciting snatches of scripture, but his words tumbled over one another in panic. Deliver me from evil. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. His voice cracked. The valley around him echoed back the words like mocking laughter. They reached the hollow by the brook, where the great tulip tree loomed overhead like a black spectre. The branches arched over the road, blotting out the stars. Here the path dipped sharply, and Ichabod remembered this was the very spot where Major Andre had been taken prisoner, where strange lights were often seen hovering among the trees. A rustle came from the darkness beside him. Ichabod's skin crawled. Then, without warning, the horseman's mount leaped forward with a terrible burst of speed. The phantom was upon him. Ichabod screamed. He hunched low, ducking beneath a branch, as the two riders thundered side by side through the hollow. The black horse snorted, its breath burning hot against Ichabod's arm. He dared not look, dared not breathe. He could feel the weight of the rider's gaze, though the spectre had no eyes. At last, through the trees, he saw the glimmer of moonlight on the church bridge ahead. His heart leapt. If the stories were true, if the phantom could not cross holy ground, then there was hope. He shouted hoarsely. Go, Gunpowder, go! The weary horse, as if understanding, gathered its last strength and dashed forward. The bridge lay only a few yards away now. Ichabod could hear the water rushing beneath it, could see the gravestones of the churchyard glimmering beyond. The pounding of hooves grew louder behind him, closer, closer still. He shot across the bridge like an arrow. The planks rattled under Gunpowder's hooves. For one breathless moment, there was silence. Then Ichabod turned in the saddle, triumphant, expecting to see the phantom vanish in a flash of fire. Instead, the horseman rose in his stirrups, high, towering, and hurled his head directly at Ichabod. The object struck him full on the face. There was a blinding flash of pain, a cry of terror, and Ichabod tumbled headlong from his horse into the dust. Gunpowder galloped on, riderless, across the bridge and into the night. The next morning, the villagers of Sleepy Hollow discovered Gunpowder quietly grazing in a meadow near the Van Tassel farm, still saddled but without his master. Ichabod's hat was found lying beside the road near the old bridge. Close beside it lay a shattered pumpkin. No trace of the schoolmaster could be found. Searchers scoured the woods and streams for days, but he was gone as though swallowed by the earth. The schoolhouse was soon closed. The children whispered of ghosts when they passed it. Some said Ichabod had been carried away by the headless horseman himself. Others claimed Brom Bones knew more than he would tell, for whenever the tale was mentioned, he laughed with a knowing look. Years later, travelers passing through Sleepy Hollow still spoke of a lean figure seen wandering near the church bridge on misty nights, his coat flapping, his face pale as moonlight, forever searching the darkness as though for something he had lost. The sun rose softly over Sleepy Hollow the next morning, spreading pale light through the veil of autumn mist. The village woke to its usual stillness, the distant crow of a rooster, the creak of wagon wheels on the road, but beneath the calm surface, a strange unease lingered. By mid-morning, the news had begun to spread. Ichabod Crane had vanished. At first, no one believed it. The schoolmaster was known for his wandering habits and fanciful imagination. Perhaps he had gone off to seek another post, or to court another farmer's daughter. But as the hours passed and he did not appear, whispers began to stir. Old farmers shook their heads gravely. The children, wide-eyed, huddled together and spoke in hushed tones of the headless horseman. It was Hans Van Ripper, the choleric old farmer who had lent Ichabod both horse and saddle, who first took to searching. Muttering curses about borrowed property, he set off down the road toward the old church bridge. There, in the dust by the roadside, he found the broken saddle, the crushed hat, and most curious of all, a large, shattered pumpkin lying beside them. He carried the objects back to the village, where they became the center of fevered speculation. The tale grew quickly in the telling. By noon, half the valley was convinced that Ichabod Crane had been spirited away by supernatural means. By evening, the story had taken on all the trappings of legend. Some claimed to have heard wild cries echoing from the hollow that night. Others swore they had seen a dark shape riding through the mist, vanishing as it reached the church bridge. The women crossed themselves and whispered prayers. The men puffed solemnly on their pipes and nodded, as though confirming what they had always suspected, that Sleepy Hollow was not a place for the faint of heart. The schoolhouse, once lively with the chatter of children, stood silent and deserted. Dust gathered on the desks. The windows rattled in the wind. When travelers passed along the road at dusk, they sometimes heard faint noises within creaks, sighs, or what sounded like the rustle of papers. The braver among them peered through the cracks and swore they saw a shadow move across the empty room. Katrina Van Tassel, for her part, bore the event with calm composure. She soon married Brom Bones, and the two settled into the cheerful prosperity of farm life. Yet it was noticed that whenever Ichabod's name was mentioned in her presence, a faint color rose to her cheek. Whether from guilt, pity, or mere embarrassment, no one could tell. Brom, however, was less discreet. At gatherings in the tavern, when the story of Ichabod's disappearance was brought up as it always was, he would laugh heartily and add with a twinkle in his eye, "Ah, that pumpkin. The horseman must have had fine aim that night." The company would roar with laughter, but a few, remembering Brom's mischievous nature, exchanged knowing looks. Perhaps the gallant Brom Bones had played a role more earthly than he cared to admit. Yet, in Sleepy Hollow, truth and superstition were never easily separated. Over the years, the story took root like ivy upon an old wall, growing thicker with each retelling. The headless horseman became the valley's most famous resident, a phantom whose legend outlived every mortal soul who had once feared him. Children dared each other to run past the church bridge after dark. Lovers whispered of him when the fog rolled in. Even the most skeptical farmer would cross himself if he heard hoofbeats behind him on a moonless night. And as for Ichabod Crane, some believed he was dead, struck down by the ghost's infernal weapon. Others whispered he had fled the valley in terror, too ashamed to return, and now lived quietly in some distant part of the country, serving as a lawyer or a schoolteacher, telling strange tales of haunted hollows to any who would listen. Indeed, years later, a traveler passing through Sleepy Hollow claimed to have met a thin, nervous man in the distant town of Greenbush who fit Ichabod's description exactly. The man, it was said, trembled at the mention of ghosts and turned pale whenever he heard the clatter of hooves. But the people of Sleepy Hollow cared little for such rational explanations. Theirs was a world half dream, half shadow, where the veil between the living and the dead was thin as mist. They preferred their stories rich with wonder and fear, and so Ichabod Crane remained in their memories not as a man who ran away, but as one claimed by the specter of the hollow. In the evenings, when the harvest moon rose over the valley, casting long silver beams across the meadows, the old folk would gather by the fire and speak of that long-ago night. The tale never failed to draw shivers and gasps, no matter how often it was told. They would describe Ichabod's tall, awkward figure, his sharp elbows, his fluttering coat tails as he danced with Katrina in the candlelight. They would speak of his hopeful smile as he rode away from the Van Tassel farm, his dreams full of wealth and marriage. And then they would lower their voices, eyes gleaming in the firelight, as they came to the chase, the thunder of hooves, the bridge, the pumpkin, the vanishing rider. Children listened wide-eyed, clutching at their mother's skirts, while the wind rattled the shutters and the fire crackled low. The story would end in silence, save for the sigh of the wind in the chimney. Then, as the embers faded, someone would always murmur, "Best not to wander that road at night. The horseman still rides." And so the legend endured, woven into the very fabric of Sleepy Hollow. Seasons came and went, generations were born and buried, yet the valley never escaped its spell. The rustling of leaves in the woods still sounded like ghostly whispers. The church bridge, half hidden by creeping vines, remained a place of uneasy awe. Even travelers unfamiliar with the tale felt something strange in the air, as if unseen eyes were watching, as if the past itself lingered among the trees.